Pam Otto serves as the manager of nature programs and interpretive services at the Hickory Hills Discovery Center, which is a facility of the St. Charles Park District. She received her master's degree in outdoor education from Northern Illinois University DeKalb and her bachelor's degree in foods and business at the University of Champaign. That's interesting. All right. And whether they are spent chasing after snakes or keying out a puzzling insect, her days are never dull. She often writes of these adventures in her weekly column, Good Natured, which runs in the Kane County Chronicle and KaneCountyConnects.com. Pam has worked for the St. Charles Park District since 2007. And her buddy tonight is Valerie Blaine. I've known Valerie forever. She is the Environmental Education Manager for the Forest Preserve District of Kane County. And she has her master's degree in forestry and a bachelor's degree in botany and French, both from the University of Illinois. From a very early age, Valerie frequented forest preserves with her family in Cook County, where they had the good fortune to live next to the Cook County Forest Preserves. During graduate school, Valerie began part-time work at nature centers in Urbana and in Vermilion County. This launched a professional career that has spanned 4 decades. That includes naturalist work in Oregon and California. A prairie girl at heart, she came home to Illinois in 1994 to work for the Forest Preserve District of Kane County, and some 24 years later, she's still with the district, as dedicated as ever to sharing her love of the natural world. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Valerie Blaine and Pam Otto.
I get the microphone first. Well, good evening, everyone, and all of you, thank you so much for the invitation tonight, Brooke and staff. We hope that now that your tummies are full, we will not lull you into that postprandial nap that probably all craving. We have a topic here that we are so excited about. We hope we share that enthusiasm with you. It is what we call women in conservation.
We're going to be passing the mic quite a bit here tonight. It is really fun to be here tonight. When Brooke asked if we could give a presentation on this topic, we both kind of jumped at the chance. Pam and I had just discussed the topic a little bit over the years, but preparing for this presentation gave us the opportunity to really dig in deep. And wow, there is a lot there. There are so many women with so many fascinating biographies. We decided that it would be kind of fun to highlight some women who are really outstanding in their fields. So any story about American women in conservation really has to begin with a lot of women, the indigenous women who were here before white people. Indigenous women as a whole held a vast amount of knowledge of the natural world. Plants, animals, seasons, and the cycles, medicinal uses of same, and edibles, religious uses of plants. The wealth of knowledge that was held in these women is hard to imagine. Shamans, such as the woman on the left, were particularly knowledgeable. They had an encyclopedic understanding of the natural world. And shamans are kind of translated as medicine men, but in fact in many cultures they were women. When Europeans arrived in North America, it was white men who wanted to talk to the white leaders of the indigenous people. That was assuming that there were chiefs who would have to be men, but many cultures were matriarchal, and it was, again, the women that held a lot of knowledge. But Back in those days, white men wouldn't have any reason to talk to Indian women. But sadly, white women didn't talk very much. There wasn't much interaction with Indian women at all. Indian women were kind of the lowest of the low. And the sad thing about this is that we've lost so much knowledge. Their cultures were an oral tradition, so there was nothing written down. But we did want to mention these women as a whole, and they are outstanding in their anonymity. Now, women have faced challenges, particularly women from in the settler era on, lots of challenges. As you could probably tell from this person that she's a little burdened. Women have traditionally or have tended to be caretakers, and being caretakers of kids, of the men, of communities, and it doesn't leave a whole lot of time to be pensive and reflective and to go out in a cabin somewhere and write your thoughts about nature. This doesn't mean they didn't have any thoughts about nature. They probably were very close to the natural world. This woman was really close to bison. And yet we don't hear too much about them. They were the ones that faced the really outstanding challenges. Another challenge was that there weren't very many opportunities for women, particularly in the sciences or in education. Those women who were fortunate enough to get an education in some field of science were often just viewed as amateurs. They couldn't, because they were women, they couldn't really be professional botanists or entomologists. Also, they were kind of shunted to less prestigious positions than men. In an old book that I found, a gentleman named Henry Chester Tracy wrote, "By long inheritance and habit, a woman's interest is personal and indoor. It does not go out instinctively to a useless outdoor world." Well, hang on there. I don't know exactly, but I think this woman is kind of longing to get outside. I think one of the challenges is certainly what they had to wear outside. And with this, I'll hand it over to my fellow fashion guru, Pam.
Thank you, Valerie. And yes, what to wear, how many times don't we think that when we get dressed to go out in the field, right? There was the publication came out around 1900. It was from Mount Holyoke College, and it was actually directed towards women who were considering pursuing a course of study in the sciences. But the article proceeded to then outline all the obstacles that young ladies facing this field were going to have to be faced with, some of which Valerie has already mentioned. But the article ended with, not the least obstacle of the budding female scientist's problems is her clothing. So when we go back in time and we take a look at what the fashions were back in, say, the 1900s, this is what we see. On the right there, on the left, what you might be wondering what that's modeling, that is actually a advertisement for something that was called the S-bend corset. Now, I'm going to read this here because this was actually how they sold this thing. They said, "It thrusts the hips backwards and it forces the chest forward into a fashionable powder pigeon shape, emphasizing a puffed frilly blouse." On the right, we have what was designated as a pouter pigeon, P-O-U-T-E-R, pouting pigeon. And I guess that was what we wanted to look like back then. I'm going to hazard a guess that the outfit on the left was not breathable. It would not wick moisture. It probably did not have any ripstop thread in it either, and none of the things we look for these days. Yeah, no Gore-Tex, no layers. That's what women of the time were faced with. On this next slide, we see a couple of women who tried to kind of buck the trend. On the left, we have a woman named Zonia Baber. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Zonia. Her full name was Mary Arizona Zonia Baber, and she was a geologist and geographer at the University of Chicago. She distinguished herself by walking around with a pickaxe as the ultimate fashion accessory. And again, found a way around those prevailing fashion trends by tucking her skirts into her stockings and making kind of a pantaloon sort of a look. It served her well. She went on to serve as the head of the Geology and Geography Department at the University of Chicago for over 20 years in the early 1900s. On the right, we have Ann Haven Morgan. I love this picture. She actually was a student. She was an ecologist, a zoologist. She happened to focus, though, in, Jennifer, I'll give a nod to you, in the field of stream ecology. I came to know her not so much through biographies online, but for a book that I have toted around for probably 30 or 40 years. It's called The Field Book of Ponds and Streams. And it was probably, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, I actually looked at who wrote it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this was written by a woman in 1930. Isn't that remarkable? And then when I see her, I thought, well, no wonder. When you dress like that, you gotta write a book about ponds and streams. When Valerie and I were looking at these women, as well as many others, we decided that they were truly examples of outstanding practicality. You can never go out without a hat. This was a field botany group from the University of Chicago. There are a few men sprinkled in there. No doubt these ladies, couldn't be trusted out in the wilds by themselves, so the men had to go with them. But this was, again, a field botany course from the University of Chicago, and they went all the way out to Yellowstone. This was in about 1924, I believe. Good for them.
All right, rarely do we see Pam without a hat. Oh, and we have some trailblazers here. Pam, I think this is back to you.
Yeah, these women distinguished themselves with careers in the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service. On the right, Peg Lindsley, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of her, but she was the first full-time ranger for the National Park Service. She was actually born in Yellowstone. Her father served there when the National Park Service was largely run by the military. She left the park to go to school out at the University of Pennsylvania. She had it in her head she wanted to be a doctor. And she got out there and she got an undergraduate degree in bacteriology, but she felt the pull of her roots back in Yellowstone. And she thought, well, doggone, how am I going to get from Philadelphia to Yellowstone? So she looked at her savings, scraped it all together, realized she had just enough to buy a used Harley Davidson. So she bought the bike and had a friend pitch in to buy a sidecar. And the two of them rode cross country from Philadelphia back to Yellowstone National Park. They had to disguise themselves as men for safety's sake. She then was given a full-time job. She had worked there part-time when her dad was the superintendent out there. She worked there part-time, but in 1925 she was awarded the position of a full-time ranger. However, her current stature there was questioned when the chief inspector and assistant to the Secretary of the Interior visited the park. He said, we do not believe that a woman is physically suited for the arduous duties of a ranger, and that service, which is already undermanned, suffers by the loss of what a qualified man could do in her place. It is recommended that women rangers not be employed. You know what? she stuck it out. Her boss firmly disagreed with her, and she actually continued to serve until she got married, at which time her husband then took over the role of lead ranger, and she served as his assistant for about 20 more years. And then on the right there, Hallie Morse Daggett, she is an interesting woman. She was the first female fire ranger for the U.S. Forest Service. She was hired in 1918. She was one of 3 candidates that applied for this position in the Klamath Forest of Northern California. The gentleman, Mr. W.B. Ryder, was the supervisor at the time. He had these 3 applications that he was perusing. He said the first applicant was a man whose reputation was not of the best and could not be recommended, not even in a pinch. So that was him. The second applicant was a passably good fellow whose eyesight is reported to be not of the best. Remember, this is for fire ranger. This is when you're in a tower looking out. However, he was one of the best rifle shots in the county because he shot more holes in the game laws than any other man of the Salmon River. So that left one other application, and that was for this young woman who was, by the way, no gentleman, is how her boss phrased her to his superior. She's one of the most untiring and enthusiastic applicants which I have had for the position. She's a wide-awake woman of 30 years who knows and has traversed every trail in the Salmon River watershed. Isn't that cool? They used the word watershed 100 years ago. Love it. She's thoroughly familiar with every foot of the district. She's an ardent advocate of the Forest Service and seeks the position in evident good faith and gives her solemn assurance that she will stay with her post faithfully until she is recalled. She's absolutely devoid of the timidity which is ordinarily associated with her sex. And as she is not afraid of anything that, love this, walks, creeps, or flies, she is the perfect lady in every respect, and her qualifications for the position are vouched for by all who know her aspirations. So good for Hallie. She did get the job. But she was very, very aware of her status as a noble experiment. She wasn't really even certain that she was going to get the job the following year. They were thinking that we can hardly ever expect these positions to ever become very popular with the fairer sex. So it was up to Hallie to kind of work it as she could. She actually spent 15 years in that Forest Service Tower every year. She would serve for about 6 months' time. And what she had to say about it, she said, "To the women who love the ballroom and the glitter of city life, this work would never appeal. But to me, it is work more than useful. It is a grand and glorious vacation outing for the very lifeblood of these great foliated mountains surging through my veins. I like it, I love it, and that's why I'm here." God bless Hallie.
A different type of trailblazing was by this lovely woman. We actually thought she might be outstanding in the field of hairdos, but this is Susan Fenimore Cooper, and we consider her outstanding in terms of her pen or her writing. Susan Fenimore Cooper was the first American writer to write a real nature book. She journaled, she published her journal in 1850 in a book called Rural Hours. And in that book, she wrote of her observations of her surroundings for a year. And authors after her would kind of follow her lead, for example, Thoreau and Muir, in writing in somewhat of a journal style. Susan said that she wanted to, quote, "educate Americans about their natural world, to instill in them a pride of place based on this deeper knowledge, and to convince them of a moral obligation to preserve their environment." Because she was seeing already in the 1840s, 1850, how people were becoming separated from the natural world. So she was outstanding with her pen.
And then we have Anna Botsford-Comstock. Anna's a woman that, as I made the career switch to this field about 20 years ago, I had heard talk of her, and I actually encountered her book, Handbook of Nature Study, but I really had no idea of the amazing woman that was behind that title. She was born in upstate New York in right towards the end of the Civil War. She grew up with parents who firmly felt that their daughters should become well educated. As such, she received good schooling through what would be now considered the high school grades, and then she went off to Cornell University, where they thought, there's a lady and she wants to learn about science. Well, that's not going to happen. So her first course of study was more in literature and the arts. It wasn't until much later, and after she had met a gentleman named Henry, affectionately called Harry Comstock, that she was able to become the entomologist that she eventually came to be. She started off by aiding Henry with a lot of his research. They did a fair amount of traveling and studied a lot of insects very close up. Her great gift to him, she was kind of like his, what we would now call a Google image search. Anytime he needed a picture, he would go, hey Anna, can you create a drawing of this caterpillar or this larva or this life stage of this insect, and she would do it. Her drawing skills were incredible. She was also a wood engraver, which is how a lot of those artworks were replicated into print. Well, over time, Anna became involved in a movement that was kind of gaining traction towards the end of the 18th century as people realized that their kids were not wanting to stay on the farm. You know, for years, the movement had been to raise a family, keep the farm going. You had to have a bunch of kids to keep it going. Well, as more and more machinery became available, these kids were leaving the farm. They were going to the cities. And the thought was that if we could get kids interested in nature, they wouldn't want to leave the country to go to the city. So that kind of is where the field of nature study sprung from. And over time, Anna, in fact, she wrote meticulous chapters. She really focused on the art and the skill of observation. And each chapter, I don't know how many of you have seen or read Handbook of Nature Study, but it's over 900 pages of how to study just about everything through keen observation. Every chapter has study questions at the end. There's also exercises that you can do, questions to be answered. Just a really amazing publication. Well, she put this volume together in the early 1900s, and she started shopping it around, and nobody wanted to publish it. So she ended up, she and her husband, they had earlier they had formed a company called the Comstock Publishing Company. So they ended up self-publishing this book that remains in print to this day. Has sold, I want to say, over 1 million copies. It's got 27 different editions. There's only one thing, I think, that maybe if she could today do it over, Anna would retract her prediction that man would never land on the moon. She probably thought woman would first, I don't know. And then from there we have another personal favorite, Jean Stratton-Porter. Jean, you might be familiar with her. She was a novelist. Actually, much of her writing was in the fiction arena. She wrote a lot of novels for young adults. She wrote a book that actually I came to know as a child. It's called The Girl, the Limberlost, and it chronicles the adventures of a young woman. Get this, her name is Elnora Comstock. I wonder where that name came from. But Elnora grows up in an area of northeast Indiana near a swamp called the Limberlost. Elnora has to kind of work her way. Her mother was kind of an individual that wasn't a terribly great role model for young Elnora, and it's kind of neat because Elnora works her way through school by collecting and selling moths. That was a big thing around the turn of the century. People had an interest in the outdoors, whether or not they were able to go out into it themselves. But the story of many different moth species is kind of interwoven into the tale of Elnora growing up. Well, Jean Stratton-Porter's true love was the moths, and she then published a companion book to A Girl of the Limberlost called Moths of the Limberlost. That painting, as well as many others, were Jean's own creation. She not only was a talented writer, she was also an extremely talented artist. She had some brushes in her collection that had one bristle. So for all those fine details, she would put, the antennae and everything else. She would just do pieces on because just incredible knowledge, incredible attention to detail. Her reign as a popular author went on for over 50 years. She however, was not able to return. She went to Hollywood. They made a lot of her books into movies. She wanted to come back to her roots, come back to northeastern Indiana, but her life was cut short by a car accident with a trolley in Los Angeles. So she was not able to continue that, but her legacy certainly lives on. Now let's do one more. Let's do May Watts. Wonderful, a local woman, a DuPage girl. She was born in Cook County. She was born in Chicago. Her father and mother were Danish immigrants, but they moved from Chicago up to the North Shore, and she was connected with the land from the start. Her father worked with the land, taught her a lot about plants. May too was another not only gifted author but also gifted artist. Her book Reading the Landscape, which was later issued as Reading the Landscape of America, is just a gem. Again, if you haven't seen or read this book, you've got to pick it up, because it talks about how to look at the land and read its story, where it's been in the past, what's happened to it. Her description of how a river moves, how islands move within rivers, is just absolutely stunning. I love this description. There was a student who was once walking behind her at the Morton Arboretum, where she spent many of her teaching years. He called her the Viking Princess. She was a tall dame, always wore that braid. As I was doing a little bit of research at the Arb, I came across the picture there on the right. Again, you just cannot underestimate the value of a good hat.
Well, no discussion of outstanding women in conservation would be complete without Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was outstanding in so many ways. We've sort of put her in the group of outstanding writer, but she was outstanding in just about everything that she did. A little background about Rachel. She had wanted to be a writer since she was a little girl, and she started writing things when she was 8 years old. And she went to college with the intention of becoming an author. But things sort of changed along the way, and she took a few biology classes, and all along she had been really, really passionately in love with the natural world. She ended up getting a master's degree in biology, and she combined her writing with her love for the natural world early on. And her love of the sea in particular. She wrote a trilogy of books about the ocean life, and so on. And those books were very popular. She faced many odds, some of which were health. She got breast cancer and suffered greatly from that through the treatments and so on. And I found this pretty interesting. She wasn't married, and the doctors really wouldn't give her any reports because they only gave reports to husbands. And so here she was, this scientist, and she wasn't even able to get reports about her breast cancer tests and so on. In the post-World War II years, she was very interested in what she observed happening with the increased use of chemicals. And this wonderful chemical called DDT, which was this insecticide bomb practically that was going to be the answer to all insect problems. She read data on the chemical, and she knew that she had to write something to let people know what was going on with not just DDT, but a whole host of chemicals that were suddenly let loose in the world. Now, the odds were great. What she was up against, she knew was going to be quite formidable, and namely the chemical industry. And the other obstacle was just her status as a woman. She just was not respected as a scientist because she was a woman. Nonetheless, with these things kind of looming large, as well as her cancer, she published Silent Spring. And Silent Spring, which was published in 1962, truly was a book that changed the world. It was the way that Rachel was able to write. She wrote scientifically, but for a wide audience. People, not just in the United States, but people around the world read this book, and their eyes were open to this pretty egregious use of chemicals in our lives. I don't know about you, but I remember when I was a kid, the trucks coming around while we were playing outside and just spraying the chemicals. And luckily I'm here today, but some people and some creatures are not. So Rachel's fears were realized in that she got a lot of flack from the chemical industry, and she was dissed quite a bit in reviews because, what could she know, a woman, what could this woman know about chemicals and so on. And she passed away early, but not without making a tremendous mark in our history. And it was really Rachel's book, Silent Spring, that launched the environmental movement of the 70s. So a passage of things like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Environmental Protection Agency, really, her book was a catalyst for all of that. I also think that it was kind of interesting that she was cognizant of climate change back then. She wrote that one species, Homo sapiens, is changing the Earth so rapidly that the climate is changing. And that was back in 1962 when we didn't know what climate deniers were. So Rachel Carson, just a remarkable woman. Another remarkable woman in a different way.
Oh boy, y'all heard of Athena Sherman? She was a pistol, boy. Althea grew up in northeast Iowa. Again, she was fortunate to be born of parents who felt strongly that their daughters should be well educated. She had a sister named Amelia who became a country physician. And the two of them shared a home in, the town is spelled National. I understand it's pronounced National. I don't know if anyone's from that part of Iowa. But she and Amelia had this sort of unlikely sisterhood partnership thing going on there at their homestead, where Amelia played the role of what would be, I guess, considered the breadwinner, and she would go out and provide her medical services to the community, and Althea was tasked with the kind of traditional wifely duties. She had to do the cooking, she had to do the cleaning, she had to do the mending, and she lamented this greatly. She was nothing if not outspoken to her friends about how all of this work was getting in her way of her important work, which was studying birds. Althea The structure there in the middle, I think, is just really astounding. It is a chimney-swept observation tower that she hired carpenters to build on their property. So she could go inside and stick her head inside a chimney. She had specially built windows so she could observe the nesting habits of chimney swifts. And her chronology, her work on the chimney swifts is just, she took, as you can see from the picture on the left, she took her work very seriously. And she took pages and pages, notebook after notebook, of her writings about the observations of these birds. She did that with a number of species. Up on the top right there is one of her drawings of flickers. She used to affix soap boxes to the inside of her barn, and they would be used as nest boxes by the flickers. And she would send her writings out. They were published in the Wilson Bulletin and the Auk, the Nature Journal. She was gaining kind of a strong reputation as a female, no less, ornithologist of her time. And then she took on the house wren. At that time, and I've always imagined, what would Althea do if she met my grandfather, who loved to build house wrens, boxes. He loved to hear the sound of the male wren. Well, Althea saw the house wren as the devil incarnate. It would come because, well, they are kind of, they're boisterous little birds. They will go after the eggs and the nestlings of neighboring birds. They will puncture eggs, they'll toss them out of the nest. And so she launched a campaign. She actually wrote an article, Down with House Wren Boxes. And then she took it to the next level of Down with House Wrens. And she was really quite vocal in her opposition. And then it started to extend to other things. She found out that screech owls were eating some of the birds that she'd attracted to her property. So then it was down with screech owls. And then she went for the big guns. She found out about Aldo Leopold. And she called him, I gotta read this, that minion of the diabolical work of the ammunition makers. He's been in this area under the guise of restoring prairie chickens and bobwhites, but instead is working for the spread of that ring-necked pheasant, which, as we all know, is an alien species, but she blamed Aldo Leopold for the introduction of that bird. And she also, she was quite opinionated. I can't help but wonder how much of this was because, Amelia, her sister, is out getting all the glory for saving the lives, and she's the one that's home scrubbing the pots and the pans, and it barely has time to do the work that she felt she needed to do. She ended up writing, like I said, there were just volumes and volumes and volumes of notes. She never got to publish them. She actually passed away. She was in her 80s, but the thought of compiling all of those notes into something that could resemble a book was just beyond her at that point. So when she passed away in 1943, a friend of hers took on the task. It took him about 10 years, but in 1953, Birds of an Iowa Dooryard was published. And so it's a really fun book. A lot of those opinionated and maybe even somewhat vindictive words are not part of it. She writes in a very scientific manner, and it is a really interesting book. But I just, every time I read it, I just picture Althea there, kind of seething. In fact, she said, where is it here? She said Gene Stratton-Porter, who was kind of a contemporary, wrote sentimental trash.
In terms of outstanding young naturalists, this little girl kind of takes the cake. She was raised in a highbrow society in Massachusetts, and she was supposed to be prim and proper. There's a story of how one day her mother was hosting a tea party, a very fancy tea party, and the servant went to the kitchen to get a pitcher of water for the guests and just grabbed the pitcher of water and brought it out and served it. But the pitcher of water was full of frogs. And little Frances was the culprit. Frances Hammerstrom was she was in love with critters and soil and all things wild from an early age, but she was in a family that just didn't want her to be such a tomboy, so to speak. Her mother thought, well, maybe I can tame her wildness by allowing her to have a little flower garden. So when Frances heard this, she just went right outside and started digging. Her mother scolded her and said that's for the servants to do. She wasn't supposed to get her hands dirty. She could look at the flowers, but she wasn't supposed to get her hands dirty. So that didn't stop her. She went and made a secret digging pit behind the shed, and to keep anyone else from bothering her, she planted poison ivy all around it. Frances went on to study with an incredible curiosity, which really all women naturalists, any men naturalists also have to have a lot of curiosity to ask questions and observe. And Frances certainly had that. She ended up getting a doctorate and in field biology, and she was many things. She was a hunter for one thing, and I can kind of relate to this. She wrote a book, Is She Coming Too? She became a wildlife biologist actually, and a falconer as well as an author. She did research for her doctorate under Aldo Leopold. Evidently she was the only woman to do that, to get a doctorate under the esteemed Leopold. And she's renowned for her research in greater prairie chicken populations of Wisconsin. Any naturalist has to have a lot of fortitude and a sense of adventure and so on. And there are certain women who really were outstanding in the amount of grit that they had. Martha Maxwell was certainly one of them. She was only 5 foot tall, but she was a mighty little woman. There were lots of ups and downs in her life. She had times of plenty and times of scarcity. But throughout all of that, her main passion was for wildlife, and particularly wildlife in Colorado. She saw in a short period of time how much wildlife was suffering from habitat loss. She determined to do her best to stop that by collecting specimens that she could then take back to cities and more urban areas to teach people about wildlife. And Martha actually was a pioneer in the field of taxidermy. So she really sort of paved the way for famous men taxidermists that came later. And what she did was preserved her specimens in lifelike poses. Prior to that, they were all kind of, like they were going to be stuck in a drawer. But hers were in lifelike poses, and she displayed them in natural dioramas. And that was very new at the time. This is Martha in the middle there with her specimens. And she hunted and preserved every one of those animals from her treks in the mountains. She went up into the mountains with not even a tent, and she would just eat fish that she caught in the streams. And to get one specimen, to get a ptarmigan, she went through a big thunderstorm in a mountain just to get this one specimen. She was cornered by a herd of bison when she was trying to collect a bison specimen. This exhibit she put together for the Centennial in Colorado in 1876. Sadly, the collection was lost. Only a few of those things remain. But Martha was quite outstanding in the field of taxidermy and having lots of fortitude. And another woman, similarly, who had frontier kind of wilderness skills was Annie Montague Alexander. unlike Frances, she came from a very comfortable family, financially very well off. She became quite a benefactor for biology and conservation. She also collected her specimens with a rifle and a shotgun. That's how people did it back then. And she got an interest in paleontology as well as botany and entomology, kind of an all-round naturalist. And her specimens were the foundation for the Natural History Museum at University of California, Berkeley. And I liked her. I guess I am encouraged or inspired by her attitude on aging. As she approached her 60s, some people questioned whether she should still be out, in the field taking all these boondoggles. And she said, "I consider the 60s a very appropriate period in one's life to do field work, an out-of-doors quest that will always have a certain charm and excitement about it." It's like, yeah, all right, I guess I'm doing the right thing. And it said on her 80th birthday, she was still out collecting specimens in Baja California. So, you go, girl. Outstanding for her perspectives was a woman named E. Lucy Braun. And I remember when I was a freshman at the U of I, and I just chosen to major in botany, I checked out this book, Deciduous Forests of Eastern North America, from the library, and I kept renewing it. I was so absorbed in this book. The book was written by Braun, who was really a pioneer in the field of ecology. So prior to this, there were these separate fields. You were an ornithologist or you were a botanist, different specific specialties. But it took a while for people to have a broad perspective of how all these things were connected. And E. Lucy Braun was one of those people who she saw the whole forest. She put on over 65,000 miles on foot, tromping around the eastern forests, particularly in Ohio, to do her research. And also she made many discoveries of new plants, and some of them were named after her. So now we get to our outstanding contemporaries. And May Berenbaum, Dr. May Berenbaum, is one of Pam's and my favorites. She's a woman who has a list of awards that is a mile long. A very brilliant woman who has a degree and honors from Yale University, from Cornell, and a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology, and she has been with the University of Illinois since 1980. One of her most outstanding things is the Insect Fear Film Festival, which Pam and I will now demonstrate.
We're kind of groupies. May is an entomologist by trade and by heart. This woman she is just a gift to the world of bugs. She can take the most complex topics and break them down into something that any of us, even if you hate bugs, you will want to read her work, because there's a book called Bugs in the System, and she talks about life processes of many species that are recognizable to us, but she does it in such a way, and she has fun with it too. This Insect Fear Film Festival, I remember it started when I was a student at U of I, and I didn't know who was behind it at the time, but I don't know, Valerie, how many times have we been down there?
More than I can count. So we get a t-shirt every year. And in particular, the one that I'm wearing was from this particular Insect Fear Film Fest, which was, the focus was female entomologists. So apropos of our topic tonight. May has had the honor of having a cockroach named after her, and also a character in the X-Files is named after her. And finally, we come full circle to another Indigenous woman. So we started with the Native American women, and now we will conclude with one. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a woman who you may have seen some of the titles of her books. You may have seen her on a TED Talk or two. Her lectures can be seen online. She's a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nature and a professor at the State University of New York. In her work, whether it be her scientific work or her writings for the general public, she weaves her Indigenous heritage and the wisdom of that with her scientific knowledge. And she really brings a lot from both to each side. She has published a lot of work in bryology, or the study of mosses, and plant ecology. She teaches field classes. She's written many books, of which I think we have some fans right here in this room. If I personally were to list 3 books that have had the most impact on my life, I would have to say that her book Braiding Sweetgrass was one of them. Robin has opened my eyes, and I think others, to things like the honorable harvest, which is a mindset and a heart set of asking permission. We all need to harvest from the earth just to live every day. That's a given. But there's a way in which we can harvest, and it involves respect and gratitude. We ask permission of things that we take. We don't take it all, and we give thanks. Those are ways to truly show our respect and our connection with the natural world. And Robin also talks a lot about reciprocity. It's not all taking, we do need to give back, and I think every person in this room is in a position of wanting to give back more to the earth. Robin also says that plants are really our true teachers. But in any situation where there's a teacher, the student has to listen. So she really shows ways to listen more to plants. She's just an incredible person. I really highly recommend you Google her online, and like I said, you can see her TED Talks or her lectures, or pick up one of her books. So we've done a real quick survey here this evening of just a few of the women in conservation. Each of these women that we've talked about has an enduring legacy. Women in conservation, it's not a trend by any means. Women have been in conservation since the get-go. And probably here amongst us are some outstanding women in conservation. So we'd like to thank you for our time, and can I have your Pam? Thanks for staying awake.